Good evening. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. If you come to very many Dole Institute programs, and certainly if you're an SAB member, one of our Student Advisory Board, you know that usually you're welcomed by a member of the Student Advisory Board. And unfortunately, I can assure you I am not a member of the Student Advisory Board. My name is Bill Lacey. I'm the director of the Dole Institute. But I get to do this tonight because tonight is a very special event. It's a Student Advisory Board run program. So I get to sit back and enjoy tonight with all of you. So thanks for all of you for coming out, especially given the weather. We don't anticipate any weather issues tonight, but let me tell you, you're in the best building probably in the area if we do have a bad weather situation. And if we do, we'll suspend the program. We'll tell you exactly what to do, and it's very, very safe. I want to remind everybody that our next program will be next Tuesday at 7:30. It'll be on the environment and energy, the role of free enterprise in the government, with former Congressman Bob Inglis. It's a really interesting look at the importance of markets and free enterprise and sustainability in solving environmental and energy programs. I want to make three brief announcements. One, please turn off your cell phones. Secondly, we will have a Q&A session after the conclusion of the interview tonight. We ask you to do two things. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and wait for one of the students with cordless microphones to come by. Please just ask a brief question, no statements, and we enforce that rather rigorously. We want to give lots of people the opportunity to ask questions. And the third thing that I would just like to remind everyone, the Dole Institute emphasizes civility and courtesy, and just want to know that there's very strong feelings on both sides of this issue, but keep in mind that you're in the Dole Institute of Politics, and we ask all of you to act tonight in a very civil and courteous way. Tonight's one of my favorite programs because when I came to the Dole Institute of Politics, there was virtually no student involvement, and we set about trying to change that. And over the years, we built a really great student culture and a really great student advisory board. They advise us on everything that goes on. They have special opportunities to meet great guests here at the Dole Institute. They learn about leadership and just have wonderful opportunities. And I just wanted to start tonight by asking all the members of the Dole Student Advisory Board who are present, please stand up. Thank you, guys. All these guys who are in college now are going to be making the decisions and the legislation and everything a lot sooner than they think, because I know I went through that too. And I am so glad that they're here because they're preparing themselves and they're getting the tools to understand how to go about that. And they're doing that in a way where we really emphasize the importance of being able to find common ground when possible, but also learn to disagree, agree to disagree if you can't find common ground. Now, this is the Student Advisory Board has been led this year by Lexi Clark, who will be doing our interview tonight with our two guests. And Lexi's put together two fabulous programs, one each semester. And so I just want to recognize Lexi Clark for her great leadership. We'll be losing her this year. She'll be graduating. So Lexi, thank you for all you've done. You can give them a little wave. She's done a great job, and we'll miss her, but we've got a new coordinator of our Student Advisory Board who will be coming in as a senior next year who'll do a great job for us. Tonight, we're delighted to have two very knowledgeable guests here to discuss the issue of gun control. Now, you have bios on your program, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I just want to briefly introduce them and save time for the discussion and the Q&A. Patricia Stoneking is the president of the Kansas State Rifle Association, which is a state-sanctioned affiliate of the NRA. She is an NRA-certified training counselor, chief range safety officer, and refused to be a victim program instructor. Patricia is owner of Target Master Shooting Academy in Bonner Springs. UMKC professor of law Alan Rostron teaches and writes in the areas of constitutional law, tort law, products liability, and conflict of laws. Before becoming a teacher, Rostron worked in Washington, D.C. as a senior staff attorney at the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence, where he was part of a nationwide litigation effort. We're so pleased they could join us tonight. They'll be interviewed by Student Advisory Board Coordinator Lexi Clark. Please welcome Patricia Stoneking and Alan Rostron.
First of all, on behalf of the Student Advisory Board and myself, I'd like to thank both of you for joining us tonight. Leading up to this event, we distributed a survey to a small sampling of KU students about the issues of gun control and gun legislation. We've designed tonight's questions based on the results of that survey so we can address kind of the themes that we found the students were most interested in. So I'd like to dive right in with our first question. How do you each interpret the Second Amendment, and how does it frame your stance on the issue of gun control?
Well, I frame the Second Amendment as something that is a protection to a natural and inalienable right that gives us the ability to defend our state, our nation, ourselves, our families, neighbors, communities.
Professor Rostron?
I think I could agree with all that. For a long time, there was a debate that went back and forth. It played out in law review, law journal articles amongst scholars. It played out to some extent in the courts. And it was over whether the Second Amendment meaning, really, should you emphasize the first part of it about the well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, or emphasize the second part about the right of the people to keep and bear arms should not be infringed. And it got framed in a way that I think was unfortunate as a choice either between an individual rights view of the Second Amendment, where individual people have a Second Amendment right to keep and have guns for various purposes, or some kind of a state right, or they'd call it a collective right, that it was only about the state. And truthfully, I always thought that that was a mistake. And the Supreme Court ultimately upheld the individual rights view of it, and I think they were correct to do so. Not all gun control kind of people from that side of the issue would agree with me on this, but I do think that they were right about that. So to me, it's a right that people have. It's a right to have guns for purposes, not just for military purposes. But what really matters is, what exactly does that mean? None of our rights are unlimited. We have freedom of speech, but there are limits on that. All rights are limited, and what exactly are the limits going to be? And so my view has always been that we can have a strong Second Amendment right, and everybody can enjoy that, but it will still come with good, sensible, strong gun laws as well, that gun control and gun rights wouldn't be incompatible, mutually exclusive things. I think that's what the framers of the Second Amendment would have thought. I think they would have thought that people have Second Amendment rights, but that it wouldn't mean you couldn't have sensible controls on guns.
Excuse me, folks.
I'm such a troublemaker.
Did you have anything to finish that?
No, I think that's it. What it really comes down to is, what's the test going to be? What kind of laws are valid and invalid? And the Supreme Court's still sort of sorting that out. It'll be interesting to see what they do in the future on that.
Yeah, absolutely. A phrase we often hear is, guns are not the problem, people are. What do you believe is the problem?
People are definitely the problem. There are always going to be people who are mentally ill, who are bad people, and bad people do bad things, and mentally ill people do bad things. The tool that they use is not what's doing something bad. It is the person that's doing something bad. And I think that we have to understand, when we start blaming the tools, we could virtually take away about all of man's technology. Our automobiles, our baseball bats, our hammers, our knives, our dinner knives. We could take away just about everything imaginable if we wanted to blame the tool. It is not the tool, it is the individual.
Once again, I hate to not be as adversarial maybe as we're supposed to be, the pro and the con or something, but I agree with a lot of that. It is definitely the weapon by itself. Guns by themselves just sit there. They don't do anything. So it's certainly a question of what people do with them that is what really matters, right? And guns are something that can be used in a good way or a bad way. They can be used, certainly they can be used to commit some horrible crimes. I think everybody would agree with that. That does sometimes occur. They can also be used for great legitimate purposes, including saving lives. They can take lives with a murder, but they can save lives in other situations. So there are good things that happen with guns and bad things that happen with guns. And my view is always, wouldn't we all want to get together and try to figure out a way that we can maximize the likelihood of those good things occurring and minimize the likelihood of the bad things occurring? And I would disagree, I guess, to the extent that I would say that the gun is this sort of irrelevant, that it's only the person that matters, because the weapon that someone has available to them does impact what they do, what they're able to do. For example, sometimes people ask me, is the United States more violent than other countries, or do we have a lot more crime than other countries? And the answer is really no. Our crime rates are about what you would expect to see in comparable countries around the world. But what we have that's distinctive is our level of lethal violence, the level of crime that is deadly. In other words, in other countries, they'd have crime like ours, but it's less likely to be a matter of life and death. And I think that there may be a number of factors that play into why that is, why there's more lethal violence in the United States. But I think the access to guns by a lot of people who do sometimes do bad things with them is part of the reason why we have a higher problem with that.
What restrictions do you think should or should not be placed on a citizen seeking to purchase a gun?
I think that certainly we wouldn't want to restrict people that are convicted felons, people that have been adjudicated mentally ill from purchasing firearms. Outside of that, people that are purchasing firearms are law-abiding citizens, or they wouldn't be able to pass the background check, the NICS check as it's referred to, in order to make that purchase. And I don't see that further restrictions are going to make a difference.
I agree about the background checks. Background checks are really probably the core. I don't support all gun control proposals, to be honest, and maybe we'll talk about some tonight that I'm not as big a fan of. Assault weapons bans, for example, might be something where I'm not as enthusiastic. But the core of my views about what could we do with the problem of guns is I think background checks are a great thing to have. And in my view, if it was up to me, if I could be in charge of all this and set what all the rules would be, we would have a very comprehensive system of background checks for everybody to acquire a gun. And I think of it this way. I remember when I was learning how to drive, they would always talk about, the driver's license driving is not a right, it's a privilege. And having a gun is both. That's the way I'd sort of like to look at it. It's a right. The Supreme Court has recognized that. The Constitution says that. But we could also treat it as though it's a privilege. And so we could sort of say, look, we're going to give people in the first instance, you have a right to have a gun. But if you blow it, if you do something that leads us to think you're not safe and responsible with a gun, we'll take it away from you. You won't be able to have guns anymore. And we would have a system in place of very rigorous background checks. And this might be where it gets more controversial. I would favor a system where we really carefully keep track of guns. And we would have a system, it would be some kind of a registration system where we would know where they are. And so, for example, we could check in with you and say, do you still have that gun? We trust you. You're a good person. We've made sure you have a lot of training. I would favor adding that, too, that people, to have a gun, they would go through some training. And we'd give it to them, and they'd really make sure that they're really responsible and know what they're doing. And then we really would trust them. And I would expand, for example, the ability of people to carry guns, conceal guns and that sort of thing. Again, some gun control advocates aren't so much for that. But I would say, look, we are really going to trust people, but if you blow it, we'll take it away from you. And we'll enforce that by making it harder than ever before for you to get a gun if you're somebody who has blown your opportunity and you're privileged to have one.
Patricia, do you have something you'd like to say?
Yes, I do. You had mentioned, being able to come and knock on my door and say, gee, you want to check and see if I still have that gun. The fact of the matter is, unless I give you a reason to check to see if I have that gun because I've committed a crime, then you have no reason to knock on my door. Gun registration, you have to understand, is the very last step to gun confiscation. The framers, the founders of this great free nation that we live in, specifically gave us that Second Amendment protection based on a couple of things. that it was already a natural, inalienable, God-given right to protect ourselves from what could possibly become a tyrannical government. Can you imagine a government becoming tyrannical and us not having our guns to defend against that? I think that we have but history to look at when we talk about why it's important for us to preserve our rights. The first thing Hitler did was confiscate all the firearms. How did he know where to confiscate those firearms? By registering them. We vehemently oppose any type of gun registration and believe that that is not the answer to crime, criminals who are committing crimes with firearms.
Well, like I said, I knew that part of it would be more controversial, no doubt about that. And so I'm not shocked by that. And doesn't that reveal to some extent what it comes down to? To some extent, these issues do turn on the extent to how people feel about the government, how much they trust the government, or what they think the likelihood are that the government would do something like that. I feel that a system of control over guns, just like we have registration of cars, I don't think the government's going to come confiscate all the cars. And if we had a similar thing with firearms, I think it could be effective. It could be an amazing law enforcement tool, for example, and the wonderful way to stop guns from getting into the black market, to the underground market, where the people who are supposed to be prohibited from having a gun can get one. But all of that, my belief in that, all of that does obviously depend to some extent on my views about the likelihood that gun confiscation would ever be a serious thing. It's never going to occur. It's not feasible. It's not legal for number one. The Supreme Court has clearly declared that that would be unconstitutional, and they're not going back on that. It would not be politically feasible in the United States. The guns have tremendous support. We saw that today in Congress. We saw the votes that were taken. And in every legislature all over the country, certainly they're not going to, we're just not on the verge. Gun rights are very strongly protected in the United States, and I just don't see that we're on the verge of confiscation if we were to have such a registration system. And it wouldn't even be practically feasible because, frankly, people wouldn't comply with it. People wouldn't, if we had suddenly a ban on guns, there are millions of people who I know would not comply with that, and so the government would not attempt to do it. So I don't have that fear, but I understand that if you do, then you would view the issue differently than I do.
Just recently, we have heard Dianne Feinstein, for instance, say that if she had her way, that she would tell Mr. and Mrs. America, that's her words, to turn them all in. We have a long history with our Attorney General, Eric Holder, who has made many, many public statements, it's well documented on video, that he believes that the American people should not own firearms, and that he has actually worked on a process to brainwash, his words, the American people into believing that guns are a bad thing. And in reference to law enforcement and what they desire, I don't know if you've had a chance to see this yet or not, but Police One just did a big survey, and they came out with some very interesting statistics. I haven't actually had a chance to do a lot of study on the survey myself, but I jotted down some really quick percentages to share with you tonight. 71% of law enforcement in this country does not think that any kind of gun control will reduce any kind of violent crime. 95.7% of them think that magazine capacity will not reduce crime. 79.7% of them say that regulating private transfers of firearms will not prevent crime. And 80% of them say it will not reduce casualties. And that's law enforcement's opinion.
I actually read an article about that poll today. It was interesting. The NRA made an ad based on some of the data in that survey. One of the things it pointed out in the article was this wasn't the kind of survey, it wasn't any sort of a random sample where they contacted law enforcement officers and tried to reach them all. It was an internet-based thing where if you go to the website, you could vote. And I don't know if you follow internet polling and that sort of thing. It's not the most scientific thing in the world. And it's a situation where law enforcement have different views about gun control, no doubt about that, but this was pretty skewed. And it was because people who really, really care about the issue could go on there and vote. And some of the results, for example, one of the results that they reached was that an overwhelming majority of these law enforcement people who were surveyed in this internet instrument said that they would not enforce the federal gun laws, that they would simply refuse to enforce them. Something like 65 or 75% of the people. I would suggest that's not a representative sample of all American law enforcement who feel that way. It is the views of some. There is a small sector of law enforcement who feels that adamantly about it, but I think it exaggerates it to say that these kind of numbers represent sort of the rank and file of law enforcement officers in general across the country.
Based on my experience of dealing with law enforcement, our county sheriffs and our law enforcement here in Kansas, I would say that the figures well represent them. And in fact, I would say that if you did a survey only of law enforcement in Kansas, that those percentages would actually be much higher.
Do you want to go to another question, or I can?
Yeah, let's go ahead and move on from that. Many KU students express their belief that it should be the responsibility of the seller to only sell firearms to responsible citizens. To what degree of responsibility do you think gun sellers have in this process?
Well, I certainly do think that someone who is selling a gun as a private individual has a responsibility to not sell guns to someone that is known to them to be a felon or someone who is mentally ill or an abuser of narcotics and those types of things. So, you know, I think it is a matter of personal responsibility, and I think that the vast majority of gun owners in this entire country are very responsible, law-abiding individuals who want to do the right thing. So, you know, at what point do we decide that legislating personal responsibility becomes necessary?
I agree, actually. I mean, the vast majority of gun owners in America are very law-abiding and responsible. I think more so than the average of the average American would be. They're great, which is why I think it's unfortunate that this whole issue boils down to being such a partisan thing or such a bitter conflict and such a sort of a stalemate that are reached, because I always felt like, really, if everybody really could sort of get together and talk about it. I mean, people all the time, for example, who will tell me, "Oh, you were with gun control, okay," and they'll say, "Well, you know, I'm a gun owner. I do care a lot about the right to have a gun and stuff, but I got to admit, and they'll make some point where they agree with the gun control side about some aspect of it, how it should be handled." So I think there's a lot more agreement out there among the vast majority of people. There are extremes on the gun control side, people who really do want to ban all guns, but I think they're a pretty small minority, and what they're pushing for is unrealistic and unfeasible and unwise. But and there's some on the other side who are, but in the middle, there's a lot of people who I think would have a consensus that, yeah, you should have you should be responsible when you're selling a gun. And I think that would be true whether you're a sort of a private seller, just somebody who's selling a gun informally on an occasional basis, or if you're a gun dealer. And in some ways, gun dealers should support some of these measures about more background checks more than anybody. I would hate it if I was a gun dealer and I spent the time of doing everything right and following the proper procedures and maintaining an inventory and a storefront and all that sort of thing. And then some, you know, people who are unregulated, unlicensed, and aren't responsible, then they undercut my business and sell to people that I otherwise would have as customers and give a bad name to the whole business of selling guns. Over the years, there have been times where the gun dealers, organized gun dealers, sometimes support gun control measures that you wouldn't expect because they're tired of this shady, unregulated side of selling guns.
Well, if I might, you know, gun sales that are private sales are less than 4% of all gun sales. And I know just about all the gun dealers in Kansas because of what I do. And I've never had any of them express to me that they have any objection to those private sales. We keep talking about background checks. People who are purchasing guns are already undergoing background checks. It's called the NICS system. Where people may find a problem is getting more into an issue of some states are not reporting people who have been adjudicated mentally ill to that system, and so certainly they could be missed. So states have to do a better job of their reporting so that those people, like the Virginia Tech shooter or like the Newtown shooter, are actually entered into that system, and it prevents them from the purchase of those firearms. We already have those background checks. Until you improve the information that's going into the system that gives us those background check approvals, you're not going to solve the problem.
I agree. I would make the definitely make the background checks that currently exist, make them as strong as possible. But I would, again, I would expand it to cover transactions that currently aren't covered by background checks. There are a lot of sales of guns that they're not being sold by licensed dealers, and therefore they're not subject to background checks, except in the few states that have gone further than federal law already requires. And I think it's a larger number than you suggested, the 4%, but if it was 4%, my response would be then it's not that big of a deal to cover them too. We're already 96% of the way there. Let's go to 100.
Well, I think what we have to realize is the people that comprise that 4% are people who are selling guns to their own family members. I mean, can you possibly imagine taking mom to the gun shop and having them run a background check on her in order for you to give her a firearm to use in the home for self-defense? We believe that that's just unreasonable, and that it's not going to make a difference. The criminals are the problem, not law-abiding citizens.
We can move on to the next question, and that is, how do you address the issue of children having access to firearms?
Oh, well, certainly, we believe that children should be protected and not have ready access to firearms. When we train people, and there are over 100,000 instructors in this country that train individuals, certainly it's a matter of responsibility that we lock those guns up and keep them out of the hands of all unauthorized users, whether it be children or anyone else. And we support that. We have a program, the NRA has a program called Eddie Eagle. And it used to be widely accepted. We could go into the schools and we could make sure that kids were taught, what do I do if I see a gun? I stop, I don't touch, I leave the area immediately, and I go get a trusted adult and tell them. It's how we raise our children. It's important to orient children. I was 8 when I handled my first firearm. Now, I'm not ashamed of my age, and I'll tell you all, I'm 57. And when my dad first started teaching me to shoot, back in those days, people had gun safes that had big glass fronts on them that were easily accessible. They had gun racks hanging on the family room wall, and the guns were hanging in the rack. But because of the way I was raised and the lessons that were instilled in me by my father, I knew that if I ever touched one of those guns without his supervision, I probably was not going to live to tell about what was going to happen to me if I did. I was not willing to take the risk of the punishment. And so I think that we have to educate our children on every level. It begins at home with the parents. It extends to the school. The schools need to let us come back in with the Eddie Eagle program and talk to the children about what to do if they do see a gun. They need to be taught the seriousness of firearms and the safety of firearms. And that's how you combat the problem, is through education.
I agree. Yeah, I agree pretty strong with that as well. It is, when you talk about the role of children or a gun in the home and how it's stored in that thing, that is primarily on the parents, and that is, there's no way around that. That's primarily their responsibility. And I guess there's things we can do to have education, and others of parents, education of adults, to try to remind them and teach them to how to be responsible in that respect. But it really does come down to whether they do the right thing or not. And I give the NRA credit. And here's an example of the problem again. The NRA had the Eddie Eagle program for all these years, and I think I give them credit for that. That's a useful thing to do. There were gun control groups that had their own programs, and they then can't just agree that all these programs are good. Instead, they get into a fight about, well, the NRA's program is just, even though it's teaching gun safety, it's got a tone that's a little too pro-gun. And then the NRA says, your gun safety program is actually subtly anti-gun. It's sort of propaganda, or it's brainwashing the kids to be anti-gun. And I don't know, maybe there's some truth in both, because you could sort of spin a lesson about gun safety either way. And here's one of the tragic things about all of that is most of the studies of these programs find they don't really actually work as well as you would hope. You would hope that if you explain to a kid what to do if they find a gun, that message would sink in, and they have done studies of it. And unfortunately, kids, right after having the Eddie Eagle training, they'll put them in a scenario where they find a gun, which of course is not actually an operable weapon that they could hurt themselves with. But they're just as likely to start playing with the gun as they were before the training. And it's true of the gun control group's safety training as well. Now, I don't say that's a reason you shouldn't try to do those trainings. Still try to do it, but you can't put, unfortunately, it doesn't always solve the problem. So it does just come right back to the parents that they've got to be safe.
Well, and I think that actually could take us off into a topic that we really aren't here to talk about. But what I'll say is our parents have become afraid to discipline their children. What I grew up with being disciplined is now would be considered child abuse, because I used to get a spanking. Now you spank a child, and the next thing you know, someone's calling the police on you. How about we get back to some good old-fashioned parental discipline? Certainly we don't advocate beating children. But you know what? A good swat on the rear end gets your attention, and it certainly got mine, and probably had a lot to do with making me who I am today.
So kind of in the same vein as talking about children's access to guns, what do you think about the topic that's come up about arming educators?
Well, we are a proponent for arming educators. In fact, in Kansas, the governor just signed a bill yesterday that is going to allow educators to arm themselves if they wish. Educators with a concealed carry permit who have completed the required training to obtain that permit. So they've had their background check and they've had their training, are going to be able to be armed at the administration's discretion at each individual school. And we believe that is the right approach to school security. We want nothing more than to keep our children safe. That's the most important thing that a society can do. But we do believe there's a right and wrong approach. Militarizing schools is not the answer. It's great for schools to have armed security, but when that armed security is at the other end of the building, he cannot get there in time to stop somebody like these mentally ill individuals and unstable individuals that we've seen go into schools like Newtown and perpetrate these crimes.
That's an issue on which I tend to agree with what Ms. Stoneking said, and therefore it's an issue on which to some extent I depart from what might be the orthodox sort of gun control position. You know, I wish there could be a police officer, not just in every school, but on every corner. It would be great. I mean, if we could afford it, if we had the resources to have police everywhere and with guns. And, you know, it would be a great anti-crime system. And we can't do that. So you know, again, like I said, guns can be used to good things and guns can be used to do bad things. And to the extent you have them in the hands of good people and they're there for security purposes and they're well trained and it's well regulated, I think that's a good thing. You know, the reason I think a lot of gun control people are more skeptical of that kind of solution, maybe sort of two things. One is they're afraid that just the message of it, or they just don't like the underlying idea of it, that it sends a message that the only way to deal with these problems is to arm ourselves even better than the bad people, and there's sort of no peaceful solution, that it's only shooting back is the only way. And I understand where they're coming from. That it sort of promotes an atmosphere of fear and that sort of thing. I can understand what they're saying, but I just, as a practical matter, I would want kids to be safe, and frankly, I would sacrifice that sort of symbolic issue to whatever extent what it's worth, and have guns there if they're done in a way that makes things safer. And maybe to some extent the other reason why some people on the gun control side are sort of skeptical of that is because those kinds of things get advanced by the NRA, and then the NRA, of course, will say, but we don't want other things. We want those and not in addition to other gun control measures, but we want that and not the other gun control measures. And you know, my view again would be to say, let's do the thing with the schools. Let's make them as safe as possible with armed well-trained people there, but it wouldn't be to the exclusion of necessarily other things that might be done as well.
So after the stabbings at Lone Star College in Texas, several of the students said to the media that they wish they would have had a gun on campus during that event. Do you think that students carrying firearms could impact the safety on college campuses?
Well, absolutely we do. Understanding that, you must be 21 years of age. So these are students of some maturity. We're not giving children guns. For you parents of college-age children, I hope I'm not bearing bad news for you, but your children are young men and women. I know they will always be your child, but they are young men and women. And they have the maturity, and again, would have the training, and have had the background check that gives them the ability to handle that gun safely and to operate safely on that college campus. And we don't believe that their rights should be violated because they want to get an education. And it is a violation of their rights to restrict them from having that concealed carry firearm on that college campus. Most people may not have thought about the fact that you may go to McDonald's, or you may go to another restaurant or a movie theater or a shopping mall, and you might be surprised how many people you have sat next to or stood next to that are carrying a firearm. People's demeanor, attitude, and mental health does not change because their location changes. So we certainly believe that students who have taken the necessary steps to obtain a concealed carry permit are entitled to carry that gun on any college campus in this country.
I hate to not be as extreme as I hate to undercut the debate by agreeing again, but I do to some I do agree to a large extent. Again, that's not the orthodox gun control position, but again, if it really, we might have disagreement about what I would want really rigorous training of these people and really a lot of pressure on them to be people who we really can trust, and that if they step out of line with it in any way, they've blown it and they've lost, again, the privilege of being able to carry a gun. But otherwise, gun control is a difficult issue for a reason. It's because there are strengths and weaknesses to the arguments on each side of it. And I think too often people don't really want to sort of admit that. They want to stake out that their position's completely right. One side or the other, both sides do it. But this is an example when I've never been a big believer in the idea of setting up a zone, a gun-free zone, if there's not any kind of perimeter around it which stops guns from entering. I mean, it was a problem with the Washington, D.C. law that got struck down by the Supreme Court a couple years ago. Washington, D.C. had very strict gun laws, but the effectiveness of that is undercut if there are adjoining places where you can get a gun more easily and bring them in. And so you can certainly have a gun-free zone that is effective in a place like an airport or a courthouse or something like that where you have security and metal detectors. But to set one up on a college campus it's a nice ideal to say we're not going to have guns. But again, if people are bent on killing people, they're not going to obey that restriction. They're going to violate that restriction. So again, I would worry about it. But I would, with extremely rigorous training and oversight and monitoring of the people involved, I think that it could be something that we could try that, again, might enhance public safety.
And this is my last question before I open it up to questions from the audience. What types of firearms should or should not be available to the public?
Well, we believe that all the firearms that are currently available to the public should be available to the public. I would like to clear up one really big piece of misinformation while I have this opportunity. We've all heard that term assault weapon. That's been the big news. We want to ban assault weapons. What you have to understand is the civilian populace doesn't have an assault weapon to begin with. The military certainly has assault weapons, fully automatic M16s or so on, but the civilian populace does not. I own an AR-15. That's one of the guns that they loathe. I guess that it looks really mean, and they think the gun should be banned. That gun operates one trigger press expels 1 bullet from the gun. Now, in the military, they have their version of an AR-15 that's fully automatic. But I'm not allowed to have that fully automatic firearm. That certainly is an assault weapon. But the firearms that are available to civilians are not assault weapons.
And just to follow on that, more specifically, there are about 400,000 to 500,000 legally possessed machine guns, in other words, automatic weapons in the United States. And the law they passed, it didn't ban possession of all of them. It banned the sale of new ones to civilians, basically. And so if you still had a pre-1986 machine gun, you could keep it, but you would be subject to extensive regulation under the National Firearms Act. And it really is not just a background check, but it's a more rigorous system of screening you, and you fill out an application, and you have to pay a fairly substantial fee for that, $200. And they really do keep track of where the gun is. You have to sort of report to the government. You can't just sell it to a neighbor or whatever without a check. It's pretty rigorous, and it works well. There is not a lot of crime committed with these legally possessed machine guns. They're possessed by people who are really into machine gun shooting, and that's their interest and their passion, and they don't commit crimes with them. So my view would be that particularly dangerous weapons, I wrote an article once, for example, about 50 caliber rifles, which are this kind of weapon that's particularly become popular in recent years, mostly used by law-abiding people who like to be able to shoot a really long distance and with a very powerful weapon. But I argued for not banning them, but putting them under the National Firearms Act with machine guns, automatic weapons, because I think they have a substantive, qualitative difference in the degree of danger they pose, and therefore they deserve a higher level of regulation, even though people could still have them and therefore use them safely. And on the other hand, as I said, the whole assault weapons thing, I think, has probably been a mistake by the gun control side to push it. And I understand their motive, because they see these weapons like the AR-15 and they think, wow, that looks scary. That looks military style, and it's the colors and whatever, and they react to it, even though they're not really thinking about it far enough through to think that what features does it actually really have that make it different from a deer hunting rifle or something that another semi-automatic rifle that they would feel should not be subject to higher regulation. So it's a little bit of an issue where emotion sort of overwhelmed thinking about the substance of the policy. So I'm not a big fan of assault weapons bans. I'll throw out another one, and then you can, because this one you probably do disagree with me on. One where I think there's a type of where a change could be made, and it was voted on today. I don't actually know how it turned out, but on restricting high capacity ammunition magazines again. That was the law in the United States for 10 years, and it expired. That I feel more strongly about. That's a more, because there is actually, unlike the difference between assault weapons and non-assault weapons, which may be purely cosmetic, there is actually a difference between a high capacity magazine and a smaller capacity magazine. And now here's the difference. I'm sorry, I don't mean to. Now here's the thing. Again, a person who is using guns for good purposes might argue that they have a need for a larger capacity magazine too, and that's going to make them a better opponent of crime and defender of people. But it also can make it easier to commit crimes, and so on that, I would tip in favor of reinstituting the ban on large capacity magazines. But I can tell you want to.
Well, what I would say about that is, first off, you don't punish law-abiding citizens for what criminals do, okay? And you never make an assumption that somebody who's a law-abiding citizen could possibly commit a crime, so let's punish them up ahead of time for that. That's not how this society is operating if we want to be a free society. As far as magazine size, there was a video study that was done just recently, and it was done by some gentlemen in active duty law enforcement. And they took 3 10-round magazines and 1 30-round magazine, and they put them on a timer. And they had an experienced shooter shoot, and they had a more novice shooter shoot these guns into the target. Less than 1 second difference to fire 30 rounds from 3 10-round magazines or 1 30-round magazine. That 1 second is going to make a bit of difference, number one. Number two, if I have a home invasion in progress and I have 5 or 6 guys breaking down my front door, you can bet I want an AR-15 with a 30-round magazine in it to defend myself from those gangsters. And want to mention in relation to caliber, you know, a .22 was the caliber of choice by Mafia Hitman for many years. It's as the same thing that I tell my students. It's all about shot placement. Has nothing more to do with that. Rather, I'm shooting a 50 caliber firearm or a 45 caliber firearm or a 40 caliber firearm or 38 caliber firearm. It's about shot placement. And we actually did a demonstration showing by shooting all the various calibers at targets and comparing the actual size of the holes in the target. And as far as guns go, AR-15s make one of the smaller holes, just to give you an example. So I don't think that limiting caliber is going to make any difference whatsoever. I personally have shot many 50 caliber rounds, and it's a lot of fun. And if I was faced with some criminals, I actually would love to have that 50 caliber to be my equalizer. However, it would certainly not be maybe necessary because I'm a really good shot. But, and as far as the talk about machine guns and the NFA, it doesn't just stop with a tax stamp and constant monitoring of the location of that firearm. The people who own those firearms are your true collectors and gun enthusiasts who have $15, $20, $30, $40, $50,000 expendable income to purchase just one firearm. And most of those firearms are actually moving into more of the antique category, like a Thompson submachine gun. My husband would love to buy a Thompson submachine gun because we are collectors. However, we don't have the money to buy a Thompson submachine gun. Those guns are rigidly controlled already by the federal government, and no change needs to take place where those NFA firearms are concerned.
You might actually, if you might read my article about the 50 caliber, because I know you wouldn't agree with everything in there, but one of the points I make is the same that you made, that the caliber, people make a big deal about the caliber. That's just sort of the, you know, the width of the bullet or the cartridge. What's the difference? But it's the overall power of the round. So I think you would agree that like a 50 BMG round is a relatively powerful round of ammunition. And so again, I'm not saying it should be banned, but that it would be subject to the higher level of regulation, which I think has worked pretty well for machine guns.
And we'll just have to disagree on that. So.
Okay, and on that note, I'd like to open it up to audience questions. We have we have Allison and Kristen with microphones, with cordless mics. Please, this is a student program, so I want to make sure all the student questions get answered, but we will make sure to take some community questions as well. Please raise your hand, they'll come to you and ask a single question.
Oh, okay, sorry. My question is for Mrs. Stoneking. What is the reason that you do not support expanded background checks for like the 4% of private sellers or gun show sales, besides that you think it's an inconvenience? The example you gave was like taking my mom to the gun store when, you know, I want to sell her the gun.
Well, certainly that would be the inconvenience aspect of it. But as I had mentioned earlier when we were really on a little different subject, all of those background checks have the potential to lead to registration. And we avidly oppose registration for the reasons that I've already mentioned.
Another question?
Patricia, you had mentioned that the right to bear arms is so important for citizens to defend themselves from a tyrannical government. For this reason, do you not believe that it is important for citizens to have access to the same type of weaponry that our military does?
What you have to understand when the founders wrote the Second Amendment was the history behind that. And what they talked about were bearing arms. And that meant something that I could pick up and carry with me. So yes, to a certain point, we do believe that we should have access to the same military equipment that our government has. in agreeing with the NFA on some level, we are compromising and making a concession there that we prefer not to concede to. But we have, and it's working well, and I don't think that we have a big issue with that. But we really have to understand that we'll wish we had those firearms if our government turns against us and the wrong person is in control and orders to confiscate guns and basically turn our free republic into a communist nation takes place.
Questions for both of you. I'm just wondering what your opinions are on the recently begun project, the Armed Citizens Project in Houston.
I don't know about it personally. Could you just maybe say a little bit about it, what it is? I'll admit I don't know. I don't know it.
Sorry. It's an organization, this guy just started it, to allow people to come and volunteer and receive weapons, and they undergo background checks, but it's for high crime communities, and they're going to try it out, and if it works in Houston, they're going to expand it to a number of other cities. Just bringing guns into the community to reduce the violence that's already there.
So it's sort of like the opposite. Sometimes they used to have gun buyback programs, which I don't think were particularly successful. It's kind of the opposite, like a gun giveaway program. You know, I guess it would depend on the details. Certainly, I wouldn't want them just sort of. I don't think it would help in crime-plagued communities to just sort of have boxes of guns and dump them on the street and say more guns will help, more guns, less crime. You know, or but so it would depend on the details of how it's being done. If if it was really some kind of thing where they were helping people learn about shooting and how to handle a firearm, and obviously there'd be a background check, I assume, would be involved, and it was sort of rigorous training. And I wish we had an approach where everybody who had a gun really saw it as this enormous, and a lot of people do, but not all, unfortunately, and they saw it as this enormous responsibility, and they were like the people in society we could trust the most. And if it was sort of along those lines, I guess it might be a good thing, but I don't know how it's being done.
I'm not familiar with the program as far as intimate details are concerned, but I can tell you that I think a program in any community, anywhere in the nation, where individual private citizens are assisting law enforcement and have undergone those background checks and undergone that training, I think that's a really good thing, and we should probably start more of that. Texas also has what's called a state defense force, which is basically a citizens militia, and the sheriffs in the various counties in Texas are able to call upon that state defense force to help in times of disaster, tornadoes. Remember Hurricane Katrina? Governor Perry loaned out some of his folks from the State Defense Force to Louisiana to assist in securing those folks and getting them to safety. And so I think that would be a wonderful program, and it's something I would love to see done in all cities.
We got one back there.
Hello. My question really has to do with 3D printing, which is a new forefront of technology. You all both seem to at least see legitimacy in background checks and having your guns registered and such to some degree. In a world where people can just print their own weapons 50, 100 years down the road, how do you see government doing background checks and regulating that kind of a thing?
Well, I'm not very familiar with what you refer to as 3D printing. That's an extraordinarily new technology, which I think people are just now even finding out about. I'm going to guess there's some people in the room tonight that probably have never even heard of that. I will say this. We just passed a law in Kansas. It's called the Second Amendment Protection Act. The governor signed it yesterday. I helped author that law, and that law provides for what we call made in Kansas guns. And it actually opens up commerce in Kansas. That law also prevents federal regulation of those firearms. We believe in states' rights and we believe that the individual states have a right to enact laws that have, you know, our Constitution enumerated very limited and very specific powers to the federal government, and most unfortunately, they have really overstepped those powers. This has been coming for a long time, but it's gotten worse and worse. And so we actually are basically, effective July 1st, effectively going to be doing just that in Kansas. And it will not be regulated by the federal government.
Do you want to say something?
No, I don't know a lot about, I mean, the 3D printing, I've just read a few articles about it and the challenge that it does pose, and I don't know that I have a better solution, but it does make it more difficult, which, you know, you have a law that says, you know, you can't have a gun unless you pass a background check or something like that, and then if somebody's able to essentially fabricate their own with new technology, again, I don't think there's an easy answer to what to do about that.
What sort of law would each of you devise that would keep guns out of the hands of people with mental illness?
Well, I believe there's really a fairly simple solution to that. Unfortunately, our mental health system has failed us greatly in recent years. And so what we have to do is we have to start working on the mental health issues. We think that, to begin with, a lot of states don't report people who are adjudicated mentally ill to the NICS system. So therefore, if background checks are run, certainly people can fall through the cracks. And so we certainly concur that there is a gap there. But that is actually a mental health issue and not a gun issue. And so we believe that states need to do a better job of dealing with people who are mentally ill, helping them get help for their problems, but also protecting the public at large from becoming a victim of their problems. And I think it's our mental health system that we need to take a look at, not guns.
And you know, it's difficult because there is this prohibition, a legal prohibition of having a gun if you have a mental problem, but of course it can't cover everyone who has a mental problem. It can only cover those where the law has identified that there's a mental problem. So in other words, somebody who for example, a judge has determined that a person needs to be in an institution or something like that, some kind of commitment proceeding or something like that, where they determine that a person is not mentally competent, that they could be dangerous for that reason. So that poses a problem. What do you do about people who may be severely mentally ill and very dangerous to themselves or others, but they haven't been in the system in any way where that's been picked up on? And I don't know that I know for sure what to do about that. I guess, again, my hope would be that if we had a system, I guess I would prefer some kind of a system maybe where it wasn't just a negative check, like do you show up in the background check. I envision this system where you'd really have to show and you'd go through really training and you'd be screened, and there'd be a greater ability to pick up on problems that people have through that kind of training and screening than we have under the current system, where all they can do is look in a database. It's not as though you ever have to meet anybody face to face. It's not, but and you know, for the NFA and that kind of stuff, they can. It's because it's, you know, it's a more rigorous thing. They can now. How do you expand that to everybody who's trying to get a gun? The larger numbers and the cost involved. I don't know for sure. It'll be difficult.
Well, but I think it falls back on our mental health community, though. The best example of most recently is the Newtown shooter. His mother made multiple efforts for a long extended period of time to get mental health help for her son. And the courts continually rejected that. She actually had gone to the courts and asked the courts to commit her son because she really did believe that he was going to be a danger and that he could do something like he did if she did not do something about it. But that was rejected out of hand. And we have that same kind of problem in almost every state. It's the mental health system that's lacking and the court system that's lacking and how that's handled. It's got nothing to do with the gun community. And again, you know, we get back to the argument that if someone's going to do something bad, they're going to do it one way or the other, and they will find a means to get their hands on a gun if that's what they choose to do something bad with.
Kristen?
Hi. My question kind of follows that up. So it seems that gun owners have a serious incentive to try to minimize crime and minimize mental health in society. Does the NRA support increased resources for mental health services or things that could prevent crime, and do you believe those things would be effective?
Well, certainly we believe that the mental health system is what needs to be looked at. I think each state needs to identify what the problems in that individual state are concerning how they handle people with mental health issues, and then try to develop programs. I know I was in the governor's office, in Governor Brownback's office a couple of months ago, discussing a number of issues, and this is one of the issues that I mentioned to him. And he said to me, you know, Patricia, I do realize that we are lacking in dealing with people that have mental health issues, and that is something that I'm hoping the legislature is going to address. And so I think that that is the avenue we look to for that. Again, mental health only has something to do with guns when someone who is mentally ill takes a gun and perpetrates a crime with it, and that's something that none of us could stop. Extended background checks won't stop it. Nothing is going to stop that from happening if that person intends to commit a crime. So I think we need to look to our state legislatures to work on how we deal with mentally ill people and develop the things that are necessary to be helpful in that regard.
You know, I just said one of the things about the gun debate that I think in some ways it boils down to is the extent to which you feel that even if a solution or some kind of gun control law would be quite imperfect, is it still worth doing? And I guess that's, to me, that's what it boils down to. Most gun control measures you could talk about won't be perfectly effective by any means, and they may not even come close. But you know, do you feel like they're still worth pursuing? I always sort of think in my mind, analogize it to terrorism. I don't think we can ever stop terrorism, and it's always going to be a danger. But I don't know that there's anybody who throws up their hands and says we shouldn't try. We shouldn't have any measures. So if people are going to be terrorists, they're going to be terrorists. So let's not put any restrictions on security or bomb-making materials or whatever. No, we do our best. And unfortunately, sometimes terrorism still occurs. But we still do our best to sort of balance and improve security. And that's kind of what I see in the gun issue as well.
Hello. I grew up in the inner city of Atlanta. So I was wondering how you guys would try and address and limit the gun violence that's already rampant on the streets.
Well, I think that's a crime control issue that our law enforcement has to deal with, and I think one of the best things we can do also is make sure that when we arrest them and put them in jail, they stay there. You know, we have a judicial system that's worried about, they talk about the overcrowding in the jails and penitentiaries and so forth. How about we fix that problem so we're not letting recidivist criminals back out on the street continually to continue perpetrating crime. I think that we have some great law enforcement in Kansas. They've got a number of programs that address things like gang violence and so on. None of the laws that you could possibly imagine passing that have to do with gun control are going to solve any of that. You know, we are certainly a proponent of very strong penalties for violation of the law, particularly if it involves a firearm. See, those people just make the rest of us who are not doing anything wrong, and there's millions of us, look bad. And we don't like that either. But what we don't think is that punishing us is the way to solve that problem.
Again, just a different perspective. One of the arguments that was often made during the gun control debate of the last decade and even beyond that was, in one of the NRA's propositions that they emphasized pretty strongly was, we don't need new gun laws, we just need to better enforce the ones that we already have. And there's truth in that, but what's wrong with it, what the problem with it is that it presents a false choice, as though our only choice is either to do one or the other, when I have to say let's do both. I mean, let's better enforce the gun laws we already have, and then let's not just pass gun laws for no particular reason, but if there are particular measures where we could improve and strengthen things, let's do that as well. We can strengthen existing law and also make improvements, tweaks in the law that would improve things, like some of the ones we've talked about today with mental health and these other issues. But again, it's, you know, I do believe, again, that the access to guns certainly plays a role in the amount of violence that occurs in cities like Atlanta and so forth. But I have to, of course, admit as well that there's a lot of other factors as well, economic factors and all these other things as well. So it's like a lot of serious problems that we have. Obviously, it's complex enough that it has a lot of dimensions to it. I think the guns is certainly a part of it, in my view. But
if I may, I'll throw one more thing out there. You know, only 10% of the folks that actually try to buy guns and get rejected by our NICS system are actually ever arrested and prosecuted. And so we need to do a much better job of enforcing the laws that are already on the books before we worry about adding more to them. You know, there are almost 30,000 gun laws in this country. They're not working very well. Let's look at making the law work for us before we worry about trying to pass more laws that won't be enforced and won't work well either.
We only have time for about 1 to 2 more questions. Kristen, looks like you got one in the back.
Okay, I had a question for both of you. When looking at changes to gun policy, both gun control measures and increasing gun rights such as concealed carry on campus, I'm kind of curious, what actual evidence is there that these measures would significantly increase public safety, and how many of these are just simply security theater measures that sound good to certain audiences based on how they feel about the issue?
So you're asking if we have statistics to show that it will make the campus safer? Is that, am I understanding that right? Obviously, we don't have those statistics because guns aren't allowed on campus, and so we have never been able to measure whether that actually makes a campus safer or not. But I will point this out. Utah has allowed guns on their college campuses for many years, and they have no problems there. Something resoundingly that we've heard over and over again at colleges where they've had violence is these students say, if only I'd had a gun. Or they may own guns and have concealed carry permits, and they say, if only I would have been able to have my gun with me, I might have been able to stop that guy. And we're not saying that it's a foolproof kind of thing. Chances are a bad guy, a spree shooter, he's going to get off a couple of shots. But it can make the difference between 1 or 2 people getting shot and 30 or 40 people getting shot. We live in an imperfect world, and we are all imperfect people.
There's one of the interesting things for me in being involved in the gun issue over the years is I'm not a statistician or an economist or anything like that, but it's been really interesting because there is a big piece of the debate that's about that kind of thing, about different studies that have been done. Not that there have been a lot of studies on the college campus issue in particular, but just in general, there definitely has been a big statistical debate carried on about the effect of making it easier to carry concealed guns, and there's a literature that argues that it makes it safer. The more people have guns, the more they'll stop crime or deter crime and that sort of thing. And then there's sort of a competing body of literature that says that disagrees with that and says that either there's really no effect or that maybe there's a negative effect from having more concealed guns. And you know, the one thing I've gathered from, it's real interesting to me, again, I'm not a sort of a statistical expert to analyze all that. One of the things that's sort of taught me in just reading all that stuff back and forth one way or the other is that this kind of stuff is darn hard to measure. That there are some phenomena in society that are so complex and affected by so many factors that you never really can resolve them with statistics. And you know what, one study, that sort of line of research that some people have done is they say, truthfully, all the statistical evidence that gets generated about guns never really changes anybody's minds. Because people who are really, really strong believers in pro-gun rights, they interpret the statistics that they see and they believe the ones that kind of support their point of view. And anti-gun, gun control kind of people, whatever, they kind of do the same thing. They filter out the information and they're skeptical of what they don't agree with and they embrace the data that they do support. And instead, people's attitudes about guns are instead very heavily driven by some fundamental underlying views that they have about the role of government and the relationship between people in society and how sort of egalitarian they are versus, you know, sort of, or how individualistic they are and that sort of thing. So it's really sort of a very deep underlying worldview that people have that's different, as opposed to something that'll ever probably be influenced by, you know, some great new studies could come out and they could say this about college campuses or that, and truthfully it won't probably move the debate very far one way or the other.
If I may, you know, when we hear about these shootings, you've all probably noticed that on the door of this building and on most of your campus buildings and on some private businesses out in the community, you have what's referred to as a no conceal carry sign. And that tells people with permits that they cannot carry their gun into that facility. What's interesting about that is that the spree shootings that have taken place have all taken place in what we call gun-free zones. And one case in point that I found very notable that's recent was the Aurora movie theater shooter. He actually drove by 2 theaters that were not posted where they allow concealed carry to a 3rd theater much further away to perpetrate his crime. And so you have to ask yourself, why would he do that? He did that because he knew that if he went into a facility of any kind where people could be carrying firearms, that he had little chance of not being met with equal force. So those signs basically are telling criminals and people who are dead set on doing something like that, you can come in here and you will not be met with opposition because we don't allow guns in here. Those signs don't prevent criminals from coming in here with guns, and they never will. The signs might make you feel better, but they don't actually make you safer.
This will be our last question.
I have a statistical question, probably unanswerable, but what percent of gun deaths are due to people who have been convicted of a crime, criminals, or mentally ill people who have been adjudicated? What percent of gun deaths are due to those people?
I don't know the answer to that. You know, we were talking about it earlier before this program began. I mean, you know, the largest category of gun deaths are actually suicides. A lot of people sort of don't focus on that, and homicides sometimes get more attention. But I don't know. I'm not sure that anybody actually has numbers that would answer that. But
I don't know the answer to that either. I don't think there are numbers that exist that will give us the answer to that I'm aware of.
There certainly is something to the idea. I mean, there are people who commit crimes tend to commit a lot of them. So I mean, I would say there's something to that idea that it's not like criminality is evenly dispersed through, and we all commit a crime now and then. It's not really like that. Obviously, there are people who are hardened criminals who commit a lot of them. And so that's the idea, obviously, of the background checks is once you've had a felony conviction, well, then you're more likely to do something bad with a gun instead of something good. But
you know, and if a felon gets a hold of a gun, they haven't done it through the normal system I go through, you know, to purchase guns. They've done that on the black market, or they've stolen it. They've burglarized a home and stolen it. And there's no law we can pass that's going to change that. What I believe, though, is that we strengthen our criminal statutes so that we don't let those recidivist criminals back out onto the street.
My thought here is that perhaps even this restriction of gun ownership to those people would be a waste of time.
oh, so in other words, okay, so I don't want to mischaracterize are you suggesting, in other words, that maybe you could say it again?
Well,
you got the microphone.
I think there's kind of an agreement that people who have been convicted of crimes and mentally ill adjudicated should be forbidden guns. Mm-hmm. And my first question was, are there any statistics that show that these people are more likely to commit murders than people in general? And maybe this is just an another thing that would make us feel good, but not make any difference in the rate of murders.
Well, someone who has a propensity for being a criminal is going to be a criminal, and there's no law that's going to stop them. So if you're asking if gun laws make a difference with felons, I'm going to say no. There are not any laws that are going to make a difference to a felon.
Thank you. I would like to, again, on behalf of myself and the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, thank you both for coming out tonight.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me.
And I'd like to thank all of you for coming out and supporting us this evening. Please drive safe, and we hope to see you back here at our next program. Have a good night.
That was a great discussion.
Yeah.